It was past midnight when I knocked on her door again. She told me not to come so late, but the truth is, she always answers. It was close to midnight, the hour when most people had long given in to silence, when I found myself standing outside her apartment door again. The hallway was dim, the single light above flickering just enough to remind me of how late it truly was. My knuckles hovered for a second, hesitant, before I tapped gently against the wood. The sound echoed softly, like a secret I wasn't supposed to share. Her door opened after a pause, not abrupt, but reluctant, as though she had taken a moment to weigh the decision. She stood there in the doorway, wrapped loosely in a robe, hair falling in quiet disarray over her shoulders. There was no makeup, no pretense, just her, 40-something, graceful in a way that age had only sharpened. Her eyes narrowed slightly as they met mine, but the corners of her mouth tugged upward into something that looked suspiciously like amusement. "Don't knock so late," she said, voice low but steady. The words sounded like a reprimand, yet there was no real bite behind them. Instead, they came softened, almost as though she wanted me to hear the scolding but feel the warmth that carried underneath. I couldn't help but let a smile slip. My reply came almost too easily, unplanned but honest: "You always answer anyway." For a brief second, her gaze lingered on me, studying, as if my words had touched something she wasn't prepared to admit. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shifted her stance, the faintest tilt of her head, the kind people do when they're torn between sending you away and inviting you in. The scent of chamomile drifted out from her apartment, faint and calming. Behind her, the soft glow of a single lamp spilled across her living room, brushing against the edges of her furniture like a hush. Everything about the scene felt quietly intimate, as though I had stepped into a place that wasn't meant to be shared, yet she was letting me in anyway. She sighed, a sound filled with more affection than annoyance, and leaned lightly against the doorframe. For that moment, I noticed everything: the way her robe brushed the wood as she shifted, the way her arms folded as though to shield herself from the vulnerability of being caught unguarded, and the way her eyes softened when they returned to mine. It wasn't just a late knock. It was a ritual, one she pretended to resist but always allowed. And standing there, with the night pressing in around us, I realized this was more than just a neighbor answering the door, it was the quiet beginning of something neither of us had yet dared to name. She hesitated for only a moment before pulling the door wider. "Fine," she murmured, almost to herself, as if she had already lost an argument she wasn't really trying to win. I stepped inside, the warmth of her apartment washing over me. Compared to the cool stillness of the hallway, her living room felt alive, soft lamplight spilling over shelves of books, a blanket draped carelessly across the couch, the faint scent of chamomile tea hanging in the air. "You shouldn't make this a habit," she said as she moved toward the kitchen corner. Her robe swayed with each step, tied loosely around her waist, the fabric brushing against her frame. I followed slowly, not daring to disturb the balance of the moment. She busied herself with the kettle, her movements graceful in their familiarity. 2 mugs were set on the counter, not 1, but 2. I noticed it without pointing it out. Maybe she had expected this. Or maybe she had grown used to it, the way someone grows used to a clock striking the same hour every night. When she handed me the mug, our fingers brushed. A fleeting contact, accidental by every measure, yet enough to make my chest tighten. Her skin was warm, softer than I expected, and I caught the faintest intake of her breath before she turned away to settle into the chair across from mine. We sat in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just full. The steam curled upward between us, blurring her face in shifting wisps of white before clearing again. I watched her hands wrap around her cup, holding it as though she drew strength from the heat. Her nails were short, unpainted, yet elegant in their simplicity. "I don't know why you knock at this hour," she finally said, eyes fixed on the tea rather than me. "Because you answer," I replied gently, my voice quieter than I intended. Her lips curved, not quite into a smile, but something softer. She looked up then, and for the first time that night, her eyes met mine fully. They held something unspoken, a question she didn't want to ask, a hesitation she didn't want to admit. The minutes stretched. The hum of the city outside faded into nothing. There was only the glow of the lamp, the rising steam, and the space between us that felt smaller than it was. Our hands rested on the table, not touching, but close enough that the heat of her skin seemed to reach me. I wondered if she could feel mine the same way. In that quiet, I realized it wasn't the tea or the late-night talks that pulled me here. It was her presence, steady, grounding, and impossible to ignore. After a while, the silence between us shifted, not heavy, but thoughtful. She stood, gathering her robe around her, and motioned me toward the wide window that looked out over the city. "Come," she said softly, as though the view itself carried something worth sharing. I followed, mug in hand, until I stood beside her. The glass stretched nearly from floor to ceiling, the night spilling in with a quiet hum. Far below, the streets were painted in scattered light, yellow pools from street lamps, the occasional red streak of a taillight vanishing into the distance. It was a view I had seen before, yet somehow it felt different standing here with her. "I like to sit here when I can't sleep," she murmured, her voice low enough that it seemed meant for the window more than for me. "The city feels less lonely when you can see it moving." Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. I turned my head slightly, watching the curve of her cheek, the faint tiredness around her eyes that somehow made her more human, more real. "Does it help?" I asked quietly. She thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes. Other times it just reminds me how small I am." I hesitated, then spoke. "I know that feeling. Nights can feel too long when you're by yourself. Like the silence is louder than it should be." She turned her head just enough for her shoulder to brush mine. A soft, unintentional touch, but one that lingered longer than it needed to. "Yes," she whispered, almost as if relieved someone understood. We stood there for a while, neither of us moving. The city outside blinked with its own pulse, but here, in this quiet room, the rhythm slowed to match the closeness between us. Her arms stayed near mine, close enough that the warmth of her skin seeped through, and when I glanced sideways, her gaze was no longer fixed on the window. It rested on me. For a heartbeat, I thought she might step away, retreat back into the safe distance she often kept. But she didn't. Instead, her eyes softened, and her lips parted as though she might say something, then changed her mind. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with something fragile and unnamed, the beginning of a truth we both felt but weren't yet ready to claim. And as we stood side by side, her shoulder pressing lightly into mine, I understood that this wasn't just a view she was showing me. It was a piece of herself, one she had kept hidden until now. The quiet between us at the window stretched, warm yet charged, until she finally pulled back a fraction. It was subtle, a step to the side, a tightening of the robe at her waist, a deliberate re-establishing of space. Her eyes lowered, and when she spoke, her tone carried both firmness and hesitation. "You're too young for this," she said. The words weren't sharp, but heavy, as though she had repeated them to herself many times before. I turned, still leaning lightly against the glass, and studied her profile in the lamplight. Her expression was careful, as if she wanted to believe the excuse she was giving but couldn't quite convince herself. "Too young for what?" I asked gently, refusing to force her into saying more than she wanted. For late-night visits. For sitting by windows with someone who should know better." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying the conflict under her polished exterior. I didn't move closer, didn't try to erase the distance she had created. Instead, I let honesty shape my response. "Numbers don't decide who we can connect with. They never have. You know that." Her eyes flickered to mine, startled by the steadiness of my tone. She looked as if she wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned her mug slowly in her hands, tracing the rim with her thumb. The ticking clock in the corner filled the silence, each beat emphasizing the space she was holding on to. I waited, patient, watching the small gestures, the way her shoulders rose and fell with uneven breaths, the way her lips pressed together as if to keep unspoken truths locked behind them. "You don't understand," she finally whispered. "People will talk. And I can't let myself believe in something that might only hurt us later." Her vulnerability cut through me more deeply than her words. She wasn't cold, she was afraid of hope, afraid of judgment, afraid of letting herself want something that felt too fragile to last. I stepped only close enough for her to feel my presence without crossing the invisible line she had drawn. "I'm not here because it's easy," I said softly. "I'm here because it's you. That's all I know, and it's enough for me." Her eyes lingered on mine longer this time. For the briefest moment, her guard slipped, and I saw not the confident woman she presented to the world, but the quiet vulnerability she fought to keep hidden. She didn't move closer. She didn't move away either. And in that fragile balance, I felt the weight of something real, waiting for the courage to be named. The heaviness of her hesitation lingered, yet neither of us stepped away. Instead, she drew in a long breath, as though gathering courage, and carried her cup back to the table. I followed quietly, setting mine down beside hers. The lamplight painted her features in soft gold, highlighting the lines that spoke of years I hadn't lived but wanted to understand. She stared into her tea for a moment before speaking, her voice low, deliberate. "I used to sit here like this with someone else, years ago. Back when I still believed late-night talks could keep a marriage alive." Her admission was quiet, almost fragile, yet it held a weight that settled between us. I didn't interrupt. I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees, simply letting her words find their way into the space. "It didn't work," she continued, her lips twisting into something that wasn't quite a smile. "He left, and the silence that followed was worse than anything. At first, I thought I liked being free, not having anyone to answer to. But freedom isn't the same as being alone." Her eyes lifted, meeting mine briefly, as if to measure how I might respond. "I didn't offer pity, only presence." "That sounds heavy to carry by yourself," I said softly. She exhaled, almost in relief. "It is. Most people don't ask, or they don't want to hear the answer if I tell them. But you," she paused, her gaze lingering. "You listen. Really listen." Something tightened in my chest at the way she said it, not as a compliment, but as a truth she hadn't expected to voice. When she asked about me, I shifted in my seat, feeling the vulnerability of her openness pressing me toward my own. I told her about my restless energy, about nights that felt too long, about moving to the city with more ambition than certainty. "Sometimes I wonder if I came here chasing something that doesn't exist," I admitted. "A place where I belong." Her eyes softened. "Maybe it's not a place," she murmured. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of unspoken understanding. Our stories, though different in years and experience, wove together in a quiet pattern of longing and resilience. Her hand rested lightly on the table near mine, fingers curved around her cup. I didn't reach out, but I let my hand rest close enough that the space between us felt intentional, charged. In that moment, it wasn't just two neighbors sharing tea. It was two lives, parallel and incomplete, finding something in each other that neither had been willing to name until now. The tea had long gone cold, yet neither of us seemed eager to end the night. The clock ticked steadily in the corner, reminding us of the hour, but time inside her apartment felt different, stretched, softened, unwilling to push us apart. Finally, I rose, murmuring something about it being late. She stood as well, trailing me toward the door. The steps we took felt heavier than they should, as if each one carried a weight of unspoken words. At the door, we lingered. She rested her hand lightly against the wood, as though steadying herself. I turned, close enough now to notice the faint traces of chamomile clinging to her skin, the warmth radiating from her body in the quiet space between us. "You should go," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Her eyes, when they lifted to mine, said something different, something hesitant, conflicted, yet unwilling to let go. I nodded slightly, but I didn't reach for the handle. Instead, I let the silence stretch, waiting for the moment to decide itself. Then it happened, small, fleeting, but enough to shift the air. Her fingers brushed my arm, just above the elbow, as if by accident. Only, she didn't pull away. The touch lingered, warm and grounding, her palm pressing ever so slightly as though searching for balance. The effect was immediate. My pulse quickened, yet I forced myself to stay still, afraid that any sudden movement might break the fragile honesty of the moment. Her eyes softened, widening almost imperceptibly, and for a heartbeat, she allowed herself to simply look at me. Not as a neighbor, not as a boy too young, but as a man standing close enough for her to feel the steadiness of his breath. I wanted to say something, to bridge the silence with words, but nothing felt adequate. Instead, I let my presence speak, the quiet steadiness of standing near, the willingness to let her decide how much closeness she could allow. Her hand slipped away slowly, as though it cost her something to let go. She exhaled, a sound heavy with restraint. "Good night," she whispered, though the word trembled on her lips. I inclined my head, returning her gaze with something I hoped carried the truth I couldn't yet say. "Good night." The moment passed, yet its weight lingered in the air, imprinting itself in the space between us. As I stepped into the hallway, I carried the warmth of her touch with me, the near embrace that never happened, the closeness that promised something just beyond reach. The hallway was cool, its silence pressing in after the warmth of her apartment. I had taken only a few steps when I heard the door behind me open again. Slowly, I turned. She stood framed in the doorway, the lamplight spilling around her like a quiet halo. Her arms folded loosely across her chest, not with coldness but with a kind of reluctant tenderness. "Don't knock so late next time," she said, her voice carrying the same familiar mix of reproach and softness. I smiled faintly, my reply already waiting on my lips. "You always answer anyway." The words hung between us, softer this time, less of a tease and more of a confession. Her gaze lingered on me, and I saw the truth flicker in her expression, the truth that despite the hesitation, despite the questions, she would always open that door when it was me. For a moment she said nothing. Then, as though surrendering to something she could no longer deny, she stepped closer. Her hand lifted almost shyly, fingers brushing against the front of my shirt before resting lightly against my chest. The touch was delicate, tentative, but it carried more weight than any words she could have spoken. Her palm pressed just enough for me to feel the warmth of her skin seeping through the fabric. I held still, my breath steady, not daring to move too quickly. Her eyes lifted, searching mine, and for the first time there was no guarded distance, only honesty. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. The late hour, the countless nights of shared silence, the hesitant touches, the stories exchanged over cooling tea, everything led to this small gesture, her hand resting over my heartbeat as if to test its steadiness. When she finally pulled back, it wasn't abrupt. She let her fingers linger for a second longer, sliding away slowly, as though reluctant to break the connection. "Good night," she whispered again, but this time her voice carried warmth instead of restraint. I nodded, my smile quieter now, more certain. "Good night." The door closed gently, not with finality but with promise. As I walked down the hallway, I carried the echo of her touch with me, the silent understanding that what had begun with a late knock was no longer something either of us could ignore. It wasn't a dramatic ending, not a grand declaration. But it was enough. Enough to know that the next time I found myself at her door, I wouldn't just be a neighbor knocking late. I would be someone she was waiting for.